in the unforgiving mountains of Colorado, where copper veins ran deep and men's lives hung by threads thinner than the air at altitude, there lived stories that would make angels weep and devils respect honor. The year was 1889, and in the mining town of Copper Falls, where the Salvation Mine carved its way into the heart of the Rockies, one such story unfolded, a tale of love that transcended death, promises that defied impossibility, and a friendship so pure it would move mountains themselves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Emma Catherine Walsh, a woman who traveled 1,500 miles to marry a stranger and found herself widowed before she could say, "I do." It's the story of Daniel Thomas Morrison, a mine foreman whose final breath was spent saving lives, and Samuel Carter, the mining partner who would stake his own soul to honor a dying man's wish. But perhaps most remarkably, it's the story of how one man's sacrifice sparked a fire of change that would burn through the very foundations of a company town, built on exploitation and indifference. The Denver and Rio Grande locomotive wheezed to a stop at Copper Falls Station on a gray October morning, its brakes screaming against steel rails like the cry of some mechanical banshee. Steam hissed from the engine's belly, mixing with the mountain mist to create ghostly spirals that danced around the weathered platform. Emma Catherine Walsh stepped down from the passenger car, her worn leather traveling bag clutched tight in gloved hands, and took her first breath of the thin mountain air that would become her home. She was 23 years old, with auburn hair pinned beneath a modest blue hat and green eyes that held both determination and apprehension. The letters from Daniel Morrison had painted Copper Falls as a growing community where a hard-working man could build a future, but the reality that greeted her was harsher than any correspondence could convey. The town clung to the mountainside, like a collection of wooden boxes scattered by a giant's careless hand, connected by muddy streets that seemed to defy gravity. Smoke from countless chimneys mixed with the ever-present dust from the Salvation Mine, creating a perpetual haze that softened the harsh edges of the Rocky Mountain landscape. Emma had written her first letter to Daniel 3 months earlier, responding to an advertisement in the Denver Post that seemed almost too good to be true. Seeking correspondence with refined lady of good character, it had read. Mine foreman, 28 years old, owns cabin and steady employment. Intention strictly honorable. What had started as cautious letters exchanged twice weekly had blossomed into something deeper, though Emma wondered now if two people could truly know each other through ink and paper alone. The station master, a grizzled man with coal dust permanently embedded under his fingernails, approached her with a frown creasing his weathered face. "You Miss Walsh?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and wasn't pleased to deliver whatever news he carried. "Yes, sir. I'm here to meet Mr. Daniel Morrison." Emma's voice carried the slight accent of her Irish grandmother, softened by years in Chicago but still noticeable to those who listened carefully. The station master removed his cap and ran his hand through thinning gray hair. "Miss, I'm real sorry to be the one telling you this, but there's been an accident at the mine 3 days ago." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Danny Morrison, he didn't make it out. The world seemed to tilt sideways for Emma. The traveling bag slipped from her fingers, landing in the Colorado dirt with a soft thud. She had traveled 1,500 miles, carried by dreams of a new life with a man she'd never met, but had grown to care for deeply through their correspondence. Now standing in the shadow of the mountains where he had lived and died, those dreams crumbled like ore under a sledgehammer. "How?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Gas leak in shaft 7, the station master explained, his voice heavy with the weight of bearing such news. Danny stayed behind to make sure every man got out safe. Saved 11 lives, but the mountain took his in return. Emma stood motionless on the platform as the locomotive prepared to depart, its whistle echoing off the canyon walls like a funeral dirge. Other passengers who had disembarked were already being greeted by family or friends, their reunions a stark contrast to her solitary grief. She watched numbly as her trunk was unloaded, wondering what she would do now in a town where she knew no one and had no purpose. "Miss Walsh?" A new voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see a man approaching, hat in hand, with sandy hair and kind brown eyes that seemed older than his face suggested. He was tall and lean, with the calloused hands and dust-stained clothes of a miner, but there was a gentleness in his manner that immediately set her at ease. "I'm Samuel Carter," he said quietly. "Sam, I was Danny's partner in the mine and his closest friend." He paused, searching for the right words. "He spoke of you often in these last weeks. Your letters brought him more joy than anything I'd seen in years." Emma felt tears threatening but fought them back. "I'm sorry for your loss as well, Mr. Carter. From Daniel's letters, I know you meant a great deal to him." Sam nodded, a shadow of pain crossing his features. "Danny asked me to look after you if anything ever happened to him. He was always cautious about the mine, always worried about the dangers. Made me promise." He looked directly at her then, and Emma saw the depth of determination in his eyes. "I intend to honor that promise, Miss Walsh, if you'll let me." The offer struck Emma as both generous and impossible. "Mr. Carter, I appreciate your kindness, but I couldn't possibly impose. I have a return ticket to Chicago, and perhaps it's best if I—" "Danny's cabin is sitting empty," Sam interrupted gently. "He'd been fixing it up for weeks, getting everything ready. New curtains, extra shelves, even painted the kitchen walls. That soft yellow color you mentioned liking in one of your letters." His voice grew softer. "It seems wrong to let it sit unused when it was prepared with such hope." Emma stared at him in amazement. Daniel had remembered her casual mention of yellow being her favorite color for kitchens, something she'd written about her mother's house in one of their early letters. The thought that he had chosen paint based on her preference, preparing their home with such careful attention to her comfort, brought the tears she'd been holding back. "I don't know what I would do here," she admitted. "I was a seamstress in Chicago, but I don't know if there's call for such work in a mining town." "There's plenty of need," Sam assured her. "Most folks have to send to Denver for any decent mending or alterations. Margaret O'Brien runs the general store, and she's been saying for years how the town needs someone with proper sewing skills." He hefted her trunk onto his broad shoulder with apparent ease. "At least stay until you decide what you want to do. Danny would haunt this mountain forever if I let you leave without making sure you had proper options." As they walked through the streets of Copper Falls, Sam pointed out the various establishments with the pride of someone who had watched the town grow. O'Brien's general store occupied the corner of Main Street and Copper Avenue, its wide windows displaying everything from mining equipment to bolts of fabric. Dr. Hayes maintained his practice in a neat white building that also served as the town's unofficial hospital, while St. Patrick's Church stood at the far end of Main Street, its simple wooden cross reaching toward the sky like a prayer made manifest. The miners' cabins dotted the hillside above the main town, connected by winding paths that became treacherous streams during the spring snowmelt. These were simple structures, built for function rather than beauty, but many showed signs of their owners' attempts to create real homes. Gardens struggled in the rocky soil, windows bore curtains sewn from flour sacks, and here and there a coat of paint brightened the weathered wood. "That's Danny's place," Sam said, nodding toward a cabin that sat slightly apart from the others, nestled among a grove of aspens whose leaves were just beginning to turn gold with the approach of autumn. The structure was larger than most, with a covered porch and windows on 3 sides that would provide ample light. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Emma noticed that the yard had been carefully cleared of rocks and debris. "Someone's been maintaining." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She observed. Sam's cheeks reddened slightly. Some of us have been taking turns making sure everything stays in good order. Danny worked so hard to get it ready. He set her trunk down on the porch and produced a key from his vest pocket. He wanted everything to be perfect for when you arrived. The interior of the cabin was a revelation. Emma had expected the rough, Spartan accommodations typical of bachelor miners, but Daniel had clearly spent considerable time and thought on making the space welcoming. The main room contained a stone fireplace with a comfortable reading chair, positioned to catch both the fire's warmth and the light from the large front window. The kitchen, as Sam had mentioned, was painted a warm yellow that immediately reminded Emma of sunshine on spring mornings. A dining table sat beneath the side window, its surface scarred from use but polished to a warm shine. 2 chairs flanked it, one showing signs of regular use, the other clearly new and chosen to match. The bedroom contained a large bed covered with a quilt in shades of blue and white, and Emma recognized the pattern as one she had described admiring in a shop window in Chicago. "He ordered that quilt special from Denver," Sam explained, seeing her attention. "Sent them your letter describing the pattern to make sure they got it right." Emma sank into the reading chair, overwhelmed by the evidence of Daniel's preparations for their life together. Every detail showed careful consideration for her comfort and preferences. The man who had written to her about mining techniques and mountain weather had been creating a home based on scattered mentions in her letters about colors, patterns, and small domestic pleasures. "What was he like?" she asked quietly. "Really like, I mean. Beyond what he wrote to me." Sam leaned back in the chair, settling into it with the ease of someone who had often sat in this room. He thought carefully before speaking. "Danny was the sort of man who noticed everything," he said at last. "In the mine, he could sense danger before anyone else even realized something was wrong. He'd watch the way dust fell, listen to the timbers creak, feel the shift in air pressure that warned of gas. That same sharp eye carried into the rest of his life." Sam gestured around the cabin. He spent hours planning every detail. Here where to place furniture, how the light would change through each window, what would make it most comfortable. And when he talked about you, and he did, all the time he remembered every detail from your letters, even the little things you'd only mentioned once. Emma drew a breath. "Tell me about the accident." Sam's expression darkened. "It was the late shift in Shaft 7. The gas alarm went off, silent killer. Gas is. You can't see it, can't smell it, not until it's too late. Protocol said get out, no exceptions." He paused, staring into the fire. Danny did a head count. Realized Jimmy Sullivan was missing, the new boy, only 18. Probably panicked and got lost. Emma sat still, waiting as Sam pushed through the memory. "I tried to go back with him, but he stopped me. Said one of us had to live to tell the truth. He made me swear to get word to you, to see you were cared for. He found Jimmy unconscious about 50 yards in, carried him back, and shoved him to safety, but by then, the gas was too thick. Danny didn't make it out before it blew. Only the crackle of the fire and the distant rumble from the mine filled the silence." Emma tried to picture the man she'd never met, making the choice to save a boy he hardly knew while knowing what it would cost him. "The company called it faulty ventilation," Sam said bitterly. "Said it was just one of those tragedies. But Danny had been warning them for months. Poor airflow, rotten timbers, gas detectors that hadn't been serviced in years." "What happened to those reports?" Emma asked. "Vanished, along with testimony from 3 men who supported him." Sam moved to the window, looking toward the mine entrance across the hillside. "Henry Blackwood owns this whole town, the mine, half the businesses, even this land. Men who raise their voices too loudly end up without work. And without work, they're forced to leave." Emma began to see the truth of Daniel's death. It wasn't chance, it was negligence. He had been fighting to keep his fellow miners safe, and the company had buried his warnings. "That's why Danny's last request mattered," Sam said, turning back to her. "He didn't just want me to look after you. He wanted me to keep fighting for the changes he'd been pushing for. And he wanted you to know how much your letters meant, that they gave him hope for the future." As evening fell, Sam showed her around the cabin, the well out back, the root cellar filled with preserved food, the woodshed stacked with firewood. "Mrs. Mitchell runs the boarding house in town," he explained. "But if you're willing, Danny wanted this to be your home." Emma looked around at the place he had so carefully prepared for her, the warm yellow kitchen walls, the quilt waiting on the bed. Comfort surrounded her, but beneath it all weighed a sense of duty. Daniel had died believing she would be part of this community, part of his fight to make the mine safer. "Mr. Carter, Sam," she said quietly, "tell me more about this fight. What exactly was Daniel working toward?" Hope sparked in Sam's eyes. Danny believed miners here deserved the same protections they already have back east. Proper ventilation systems, regular equipment inspections, emergency procedures that actually work. He'd been corresponding with mining engineers in Pennsylvania, learning about new techniques that could prevent accidents like the one that killed him. And the company opposed these improvements? Every single one. Blackwood's position was that mining is inherently dangerous, and men who don't like the risks can find work elsewhere. But Danny believed that most mining deaths are preventable if you invest in proper safety measures. Sam pulled a wooden box from beneath the side table and opened it to reveal stacks of papers covered with Daniel's careful handwriting. These are his notes, his correspondence with experts, his plans for making the Salvation Mine the safest operation in Colorado. Emma examined the papers with growing amazement. Daniel's letters to her had hinted at his thoughtful nature, but this represented months of dedicated research and planning. Technical drawings showed improved ventilation designs. Correspondence with equipment manufacturers detailed costs and installation procedures, and careful documentation proved that other mines had successfully implemented similar safety measures. He was building a case, she realized. "A case that died with him," Sam said grimly. "Or so Blackwood thinks. But Danny made me promise to continue the work, and he specifically asked that if anything happened to him, you should know about what he was trying to accomplish." As the mountain darkness deepened around the cabin, Emma found herself facing a choice she had never anticipated. She had come to Copper Falls expecting to begin a new life as Daniel Morrison's wife, to be a partner in building a home and perhaps raising a family in this remote mountain community. Instead, she was being asked to become a partner in continuing his unfinished work, to honor the memory of a man she had loved through letters by fighting for the safety of miners she had never met. Outside, the night shift was heading up the mountain toward the mine entrance, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. These were the men Daniel had died trying to protect, workers who descended into the earth each day knowing that faulty equipment and inadequate safety measures made every shift a gamble with death. Their families lived in the cabins scattered across the hillside, women who kissed their husbands goodbye each morning without knowing if they would return, children who learned early that mining was both their livelihood and their greatest threat. "Sam," Emma said quietly, her decision crystallizing as she watched the lights move up the mountain, "tell me everything Daniel was planning. I want to understand not just what he died for, but what he lived for. And then I want to know how we're going to make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." The Promise Keeper's journey was about to begin, though neither Emma nor Sam yet understood the forces they would face or the changes their determination would bring to the town of Copper Falls, in the yellow kitchen of a cabin prepared with love for a bride who would never have a wedding. The seeds of a revolution were being planted that would shake the very foundations of Henry Blackwood's empire. Dawn arrived over Copper Falls with the harsh clang of the mine whistle, a sound that cut through the mountain air like a blade through silk. Emma woke in Daniel's bed to the unfamiliar symphony of a mining town stirring to life, the clatter of lunch pails, the heavy footsteps of men heading toward their underground workplace, and the distant rumble of ore cars being loaded for transport down the mountain. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with faces she had never seen and a voice she would never hear speaking words from letters she had memorized. The yellow kitchen walls seemed different in the morning light, warmer somehow, as if they held the echo of Daniel's hopes for their life together. Emma found coffee beans in a tin canister and discovered that someone, likely Sam, had left fresh milk on the porch step, along with a loaf of bread wrapped in clean cloth. The simple kindness of the gesture reminded her that she was not entirely alone in this strange mountain community, despite the circumstances that had brought her here. She was still learning the rhythms of high-altitude living when a knock came at the door. Through the front window, she could see a woman of middle age with graying brown hair pulled back severely and a practical dress that spoke of someone accustomed to hard work and harder choices. The woman's face bore the kind of weathered strength that Emma had learned to recognize in her mother's Irish immigrant friends, people who had seen enough of life's cruelties to appreciate its small mercies. "Miss Walsh, I'm Margaret O'Brien from the general store," the woman said when Emma opened the door. Her voice carried the musical lilt of County Cork, softened by years in America, but still unmistakably Irish. "I knew Danny well, and I wanted to pay my respects and see if you needed anything to get settled proper." Margaret's eyes took in Emma's appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who had helped many newcomers adapt to mountain life. "You'll be needing warmer clothes before the snow comes," she observed. "What you wore from Chicago won't see you through a Colorado winter, especially up here where the wind has teeth." Over cups of coffee at Daniel's carefully chosen table, Margaret shared the history that Emma needed to understand her new home. Copper Falls had been little more than a prospecting camp 15 years earlier, but the discovery of rich ore veins had drawn investors and workers from across the country. Henry Blackwood had arrived with capital from Boston banking families, buying up mineral rights and establishing the infrastructure that turned scattered claims into a proper mining operation. At first, things seemed promising, Margaret explained, her hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup as if drawing comfort from its heat. Blackwood built the company store, helped establish the church, even funded the school. But prosperity has a way of changing men, especially when they hold all the power in a place like this. The company store system had gradually evolved into something approaching indentured servitude. Workers were paid in scrip that could only be spent at Blackwood's establishments, and the prices were set high enough to ensure that most miners remained perpetually in debt. Housing was company-owned, rented at rates that consumed most of a man's wages, and those who complained about conditions found their employment terminated and their families evicted. Danny was different, Margaret continued, her voice taking on the reverence reserved for speaking of the dead. He'd worked in Pennsylvania mines before coming west, and he'd seen how things could be done better. Safety equipment, fair wages, proper medical care for injured workers. He believed Copper Falls could be a model for the whole territory. Emma learned that Daniel's campaign for improved safety measures had begun quietly, with conversations among trusted friends and careful documentation of dangerous conditions. He had used his position as foreman to implement small improvements where possible, better placement of warning signs, more frequent inspection of support timbers, additional ventilation in problematic areas. But the more he learned about modern mining techniques, the more ambitious his vision became. He wrote to mining colleges back east, Margaret said, producing a small bundle of letters from her apron pocket. Correspondence with professors who studied industrial safety. Danny believed that if he could prove the economic benefits of safer practices, fewer accidents meant more productive workers, Blackwood might be willing to invest in improvements. The letters revealed Daniel's methodical approach to building his case. He had calculated the costs of accidents in terms of lost productivity, medical expenses, and replacement training for injured or killed workers. His research showed that mines with better safety records also had higher output and lower turnover, making them more profitable in the long run. But Blackwood had rejected every proposal, viewing safety expenditures as unnecessary overhead that reduced immediate profits. "That's when Danny started talking about going over Blackwood's head," Margaret said quietly. "Writing to territorial authorities, maybe even federal mine inspectors. Dangerous talk in a company town." Emma was beginning to understand the true significance of the papers Sam had shown her the previous evening. Daniel hadn't simply been a concerned worker trying to improve conditions. He had been building a comprehensive case for regulatory intervention that could have forced changes throughout the mining industry. His death had silenced the most knowledgeable and persistent voice for reform in Copper Falls, which explained why Blackwood seemed so unconcerned about continuing safety problems. Their conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time, Emma found herself facing a small, thin man with nervous eyes and ink-stained fingers. He introduced himself as Walter Kenning, editor of the Copper Falls Gazette, the weekly newspaper that served the mining community. His manner suggested someone who had learned to move carefully in a town where the wrong words could cost a man his livelihood. "Miss Walsh, I was hoping we might speak about Mr. Morrison," Walter said, glancing nervously toward Margaret. "For his obituary, you understand, to honor his memory properly." But as they talked, it became clear that Walter's interest went beyond simple tribute. He had been aware of Daniel's safety advocacy and had quietly supported it, though his newspaper's dependence on company advertising limited how openly he could report on controversial topics. Daniel's death had left him wrestling with questions about journalistic responsibility and community obligation. Danny kept meticulous records, Walter explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Accident reports, safety violations, correspondence with authorities. If that information could be published somewhere beyond Blackwood's reach, it might save lives. Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. These people were looking to her not simply as Daniel's intended bride, but as his potential successor in the fight for mining safety. Yet she knew almost nothing about mining techniques, industrial practices, or the political complexities of territorial governance. How could she possibly continue work that required expertise she didn't possess? The answer came from an unexpected source, Dr. William Hayes arrived as Walter was preparing to leave, carrying his medical bag and wearing the grave expression that Emma was learning to associate with anyone who dealt regularly with mining injuries. He was a man in his 50s with silver-streaked brown hair, and the gentle manner that came from years of treating pain he could not always cure. "Miss Walsh, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," he said. "I wanted to express my condolences and to discuss something that might seem inappropriate so soon after your loss." Dr. Hayes had been documenting mining injuries and illnesses for 12 years, maintaining detailed records that told a story of preventable suffering. His files contained evidence of patterns that supported Daniel's safety concerns, respiratory problems from inadequate ventilation, crush injuries from faulty equipment, deaths from gas exposure that proper detection systems could have prevented. Danny and I corresponded regularly about the medical evidence for improved safety measures, the doctor explained. "My records support everything he was trying to accomplish, but I lack his technical knowledge of mining operations. Without someone who understands both the medical costs and the engineering solutions, the evidence remains just numbers in ledger books." Emma found herself staring at Daniel's research papers with new understanding. The technical drawings and correspondence with experts weren't just academic exercises, they were blueprints for saving lives. The careful cost analyses weren't mere numbers, they were calculations of human suffering that could be prevented. And the documentation of safety violations wasn't simply record keeping, It was evidence of criminal negligence that continued to endanger every man who descended into the Salvation Mine. "What exactly are you asking of me?" she said finally. Though she suspected she already knew the answer, Dr. Hayes exchanged glances with Margaret and Walter before responding. Danny believed that change would require pressure from outside the company structure. Someone who couldn't be fired or evicted, who had no financial dependence on Blackwood's goodwill. He thought that if his safety research could be presented by someone with moral authority but no economic vulnerability, it might force territorial authorities to take action. "A widow," Emma said quietly. "Someone whose husband died because of the problems he was trying to solve." "Danny's widow," Margaret corrected gently. "Even though the ceremony never took place, everyone in town knows you came here to marry him. You have standing to speak for him in ways that none of us do." Emma walked to the window and looked out toward the mine entrance visible on the distant hillside. Even from this distance, she could see the thin column of smoke rising from the ventilation shaft, evidence of the fires that burned continuously below ground to power the equipment that extracted copper from the mountain's heart. Somewhere in those tunnels, men were working in conditions that had already killed her intended husband and would likely claim more lives if nothing changed. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. She had traveled to Colorado expecting to become a miner's wife, to build a life supporting one man's dangerous occupation. Instead, she was being asked to become an advocate for an entire community of workers, to take on the fight that Daniel had died pursuing. It was a role she had never imagined and felt utterly unprepared to fill. "I don't know anything about mining," she admitted. "I can read Daniel's research, but I don't understand most of the technical details. How could I possibly argue with engineers and government officials about something I don't comprehend?" Dr. Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the cabin. Danny anticipated that concern. He believed that the most powerful advocacy would come not from technical expertise, but from human understanding. The families who lose husbands and fathers to preventable accidents don't need to understand ventilation calculations. They need someone to speak for their grief and demand accountability. Walter nodded eagerly. Public sentiment can accomplish what technical arguments cannot. If your story, Danny's story, could reach newspapers in Denver and Colorado Springs, it might create pressure that Blackwood couldn't ignore. Over the following days, Emma began to understand the full scope of what Daniel had been attempting. His correspondence revealed a network of mining safety advocates across the Western Territories, engineers and doctors and reform-minded officials who were working to improve industrial practices throughout the region. His death had broken one link in that network, but the connections he had established remained, waiting for someone to resume the correspondence and continue the work. Sam proved an invaluable guide to understanding the technical aspects of Daniel's research. His years of experience in the mines gave him practical knowledge that complemented Emma's growing grasp of the political and economic dimensions of the safety campaign. Together they worked through Daniel's papers, organizing this evidence and identifying the most compelling arguments for regulatory intervention. "The key is proving that better safety isn't just morally right, but economically beneficial," Sam explained one evening as they sorted through correspondence with mining engineers in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. "Blackwood understands profit better than he understands human suffering. If we can show that safe mines are more profitable mines, we might get his attention." Emma had also begun to understand the personal risks involved in continuing Daniel's work. Workers who had supported his safety initiatives found their shifts reduced or their housing reassigned to less desirable locations. Walter Kenning faced constant pressure to avoid controversial topics in his newspaper, with advertising boycotts threatened whenever he reported too critically on company policies. Even Dr. Hayes had been warned that his medical opinions were unwelcome if they challenged company narratives about accident causes. "They're trying to erase Danny's influence," Margaret observed during one of her daily visits to check on Emma's welfare. "Make it seem like his concerns died with him." But Daniel's influence proved more resilient than Blackwood had anticipated. Workers continued to discuss safety problems among themselves, sharing information about dangerous conditions and supporting colleagues who raised concerns. Families affected by mining accidents found comfort in knowing that someone had been fighting to prevent such tragedies, even if he had ultimately failed to save himself. Emma's presence in the community added a new dimension to these conversations. As Daniel's intended bride, she represented both his personal sacrifice and his professional dedication. Her decision to remain in Copper Falls despite the tragic circumstances of her arrival was seen as evidence of commitment to his values and his vision for the community. The first real test of her resolve came when Henry Blackwood himself arrived at the cabin unannounced one evening. Emma had heard descriptions of the mine owner, but was still unprepared for the reality of his presence. He was a man of average height but commanding bearing, with silver hair and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the rough mountain setting. His manner combined surface courtesy with underlying menace, the behavior of someone accustomed to having his wishes treated as commands. "Miss Walsh, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," he said, though his tone suggested he expected no such forgiveness to be necessary. "I wanted to express my personal condolences for your loss and to discuss your situation here in Copper Falls." Blackwood's offer was couched in terms of generous concern for her welfare. The company would purchase return passage to Chicago and provide additional funds to help her reestablish herself in more familiar surroundings. The cabin would be sold and the proceeds forwarded to her as compensation for her travel expenses and emotional suffering. It was, he emphasized, far more than company policy required. A gesture of respect for Daniel Morrison's service and sympathy for her unfortunate circumstances. Of course, continuing to live in a mining town would be difficult for someone in your position, he continued smoothly. Constant reminders of tragedy, isolation from family and friends, limited opportunities for someone of your background and education. I'm sure you can see that returning to Chicago would be the sensible choice. Emma listened to the carefully constructed arguments while watching Blackwood's eyes. Beneath the surface sympathy, she could see calculation and impatience. This was not an offer born of genuine concern, but a strategic move to remove a potential problem. Daniel's research and her connection to it represented a threat that Blackwood preferred to eliminate through persuasion rather than confrontation. "That's very generous, Mr. Blackwood," she replied carefully. "I'll certainly consider your offer." "I do hope you'll consider it quickly," he said, his tone hardening slightly. Winter comes early in the mountains, and travel becomes much more difficult once the snow begins. It would be unfortunate if circumstances forced you to remain here through the harsh months when you could be settling into a comfortable situation. Back home, after he left, Emma sat in Daniel's reading chair and contemplated the choice she faced. Blackwood's offer represented safety and familiar surroundings, a return to the life she had known before her correspondence with a Colorado miner had opened new possibilities. But accepting it would also mean abandoning the work that had given Daniel's life meaning, leaving the safety problems that had killed him unaddressed and likely to claim more lives. The decision crystallized when she thought about the young miner Jimmy Sullivan, whose rescue had cost Daniel his life. Somewhere in Copper Falls, Jimmy was probably wrestling with survivor's guilt, wondering why he had lived when a better man had died saving him. If Daniel's sacrifice was to have any lasting meaning, it would have to be measured not in the life of one rescued worker, but in the prevention of future tragedies through the safety improvements he had died pursuing. That night, Emma wrote 2 letters. The first was to her sister in Chicago, explaining her decision to remain in Colorado and requesting that her few remaining possessions be shipped west. The second was to the mining safety expert at the Colorado School of Mines, whose correspondence with Daniel had been among his most detailed and technical. In it, she introduced herself as Daniel Morrison's intended widow and expressed her desire to continue his advocacy work with whatever guidance and support the academic community could provide. The letters represented more than personal correspondence. They were declarations of intent that would transform a mail order bride's tragic journey into something resembling a crusade. Emma Catherine Walsh was about to discover that some promises transcend death, and that the most powerful advocacy sometimes comes from the most unexpected voices. The response from Professor Edmund Hartwell at the Colorado School of Mines arrived 3 weeks after Emma had mailed her letter, carried by the same locomotive that had brought her to Copper Falls in what seemed like a lifetime ago. The envelope bore the official seal of the institution, and Emma's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal in the yellow kitchen, where she had spent so many evenings poring over Daniel's research. Professor Hartwell's letter was both encouraging and sobering. He had indeed corresponded extensively with Daniel Morrison and had been deeply impressed by the foreman's thorough understanding of mining safety principles. More importantly, he confirmed that Daniel's proposed improvements were not only technically sound, but represented best practices that had proven successful in mines throughout Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The professor had been planning to visit Copper Falls in the spring to observe the Salvation Mines operations and discuss implementation strategies with Daniel personally. But the most significant revelation in Hartwell's letter was his offer to continue that collaboration with Emma as Daniel's representative. The professor explained that mining safety advocacy required not just technical expertise, but moral authority and public support qualities that Emma could provide in ways that academic researchers could not. He proposed a partnership wherein his technical knowledge would support her public advocacy, creating a combination of scientific credibility and human appeal that might succeed where purely technical arguments had failed. Emma read the letter 3 times before fully grasping its implications. She was being offered the chance to join a broader movement for industrial safety reform, to become part of a network of advocates working throughout the Western territories, to prevent the kind of tragedy that had claimed Daniel's life. Yet the professor's letter also made clear the magnitude of opposition she would face, describing mining companies' systematic resistance to safety improvements and their willingness to use economic and political pressure to silence critics. Sam arrived at the cabin that evening to find Emma sitting at Daniel's desk, surrounded by technical drawings and correspondence. The past weeks had changed her in subtle but noticeable ways. The uncertainty and grief that had marked her arrival had been replaced by a quiet determination that reminded him of Daniel in his most focused moments. Her auburn hair was pinned back more severely now, and she had begun wearing Daniel's old work shirt over her dress when studying his papers, as if drawing strength from the connection to his purpose. Professor Hartwell wants to visit next month, Emma told him without preamble. He thinks we can build a case strong enough to force territorial intervention in mine safety practices, but it will require documented evidence of specific violations and testimony from workers willing to risk their jobs. Sam settled into the chair across from her, his expression troubled. Emma, you need to understand what you're talking about. Blackwood doesn't just control the mine, he controls housing, credit, supplies, everything that keeps families alive up here. Workers who testify against the company don't just lose their jobs, they lose their homes. Their children go hungry. Then we need to find another way to protect them, Emma replied with a conviction that surprised them both. Daniel was building something here, and it wasn't just about improving ventilation systems or replacing old equipment. He was trying to prove that workers deserve basic protections, that their lives have value beyond their productivity. The conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the door. Sam opened it to reveal Jimmy Sullivan, the young miner whose rescue had cost Daniel his life. Jimmy was barely 20 years old, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most Daylight hours underground and the haunted expression of someone carrying survivor's guilt. His hands shook as he removed his cap, and his voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Miss Walsh, I'm sorry to bother you, but something's happened in the mine. Something bad." The story Jimmy told confirmed Emma's worst fears about the consequences of ignoring Daniel's safety warnings. A new section of Shaft 7 had been opened without proper ventilation assessment, and workers had begun experiencing symptoms of gas exposure, headaches, dizziness, and respiratory problems that Dr. Hayes recognized as early signs of poisoning. The company's response had been to rotate crews more frequently rather than address the underlying ventilation problems, essentially spreading the exposure among more workers instead of eliminating the hazard. "Tom Brady collapsed yesterday," Jimmy continued, his voice growing stronger as anger overcame fear. "Been complaining about breathing problems for a week, but the foreman told him it was just altitude adjustment. Dr. Hayes says his lungs are damaged permanent-like." Emma felt the familiar surge of outrage that had become her constant companion since learning about the conditions that had killed Daniel. Tom Brady was a man in his 30s with 2 young children, a dedicated worker whose only crime had been trusting his employers to provide a reasonably safe workplace. His permanent injury represented not just personal tragedy, but company negligence that would likely be covered up or blamed on worker carelessness. "How many others are showing symptoms?" Sam asked grimly. "Near a dozen, though most are too scared to report it officially. They know what happens to workers who make trouble about safety issues." Emma stood and moved to the window, looking out toward the mine entrance where the night shift was beginning their descent into the tunnels. Each of those distant figures represented a family depending on dangerous work for survival, people caught between the necessity of earning wages and the reality of risking their lives in preventable accidents. Daniel's research had shown that these dangers could be eliminated with proper investment in safety equipment and procedures, but Blackwood's refusal to implement improvements was turning the mountain itself into a slow-motion massacre. "Jimmy," she said, turning back to face the young miner, "would you be willing to make a formal statement about what you've witnessed? Not for the company, but for outside authorities who might be able to force changes?" Jimmy's face went pale, and he glanced nervously at Sam before responding. "Miss Walsh, I want to help, truly I do. Danny died saving my life, and I think about that every day. But I got a widowed mother depending on my wages, and if Blackwood finds out I'm talking to outsiders about mine conditions, what if there was a way to protect workers who provided testimony?" Emma asked, an idea forming in her mind. Professor Hartwell represents academic institutions that have influence with territorial authorities. If multiple workers provided coordinated testimony, it might be harder for the company to retaliate against everyone simultaneously. Sam shook his head skeptically. "Emma, you're talking about organizing what amounts to a work action. That's exactly the kind of activity that gets people blacklisted throughout the territory. No mining company will hire a man known to be a troublemaker." But Emma was remembering something from Daniel's correspondence with mining safety advocates. In Pennsylvania, workers there had successfully organized safety committees that documented hazardous conditions and lobbied for improvements without facing mass retaliation. The key had been presenting their concerns through legal channels and maintaining solidarity among enough workers to make mass firings economically impractical. Over the following days, Emma began reaching out to families affected by mining accidents and safety violations. Her status as Daniel's intended widow gave her access to conversations that might have been impossible for an outsider, and her genuine concern for workers' welfare gradually overcame initial suspicion about her motives. She discovered a community network of mutual support that had developed in response to company indifference miners' wives who helped families cope with injuries, informal systems for sharing resources when workers faced reduced wages or job loss, and whispered warnings about dangerous conditions that company supervisors ignored. Margaret O'Brien proved instrumental in connecting Emma with the wives and mothers who formed the backbone of this informal support network. These women understood the human cost of mining accidents in ways that economic analyses and technical reports could never capture. They had nursed husbands through respiratory illnesses, stretched meager wages to cover medical expenses that company insurance wouldn't pay, and raised children who might never know their fathers due to preventable workplace tragedies. The company treats accidents like they're acts of God, explained Mary Kowalski, whose husband had been partially paralyzed in a cave-in the previous year. Natural disasters that nobody could have prevented. But we know different. We see the same problems causing the same kinds of injuries year after year. Emma began documenting these stories with the same methodical approach that Daniel had used. In his technical research, each family's experience became part of a larger pattern of corporate negligence and worker suffering that complemented the engineering evidence that Daniel had compiled. Together, the human stories and technical documentation created a comprehensive picture of how profit-driven decision-making was systematically endangering lives that could be protected with reasonable safety investments. The breakthrough came when Dr. Hayes agreed to provide medical documentation supporting the workers' accounts. His patient records contained detailed evidence of injury patterns and health problems that correlated directly with specific mining hazards that Daniel had identified in his safety reports. The doctor's professional standing and careful documentation provided the credibility that anecdotal accounts alone might lack in official proceedings. I've been treating the consequences of these safety failures for 12 years, Dr. Hayes told Emma during one of their planning sessions. Keeping detailed records was my way of honoring the men who suffered, even when I couldn't prevent their suffering. If those records can now be used to prevent future injuries, then perhaps some good can come from all that pain. Professor Hartwell arrived in Copper Falls on a crisp November morning, bringing with him not only technical expertise, but connections to territorial officials and reform-minded politicians who might be willing to act on compelling evidence of mining safety violations. He was a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to academic debates and the practical wisdom of someone who had spent time in actual mines, observing working conditions firsthand. His first visit to the Salvation Mine confirmed his worst expectations based on Daniel's correspondence. Ventilation systems were inadequate and poorly maintained. Safety equipment was obsolete or missing entirely, and working practices violated basic principles that had been established as industry standards decades earlier. But more importantly, his conversations with workers revealed systematic suppression of safety concerns and retaliation against anyone who raised uncomfortable questions about hazardous conditions. "This is worse than I expected," he told Emma. After spending 3 days documenting conditions throughout the mine complex, Daniel's technical assessments were actually conservative. The safety violations are more extensive and more dangerous than even his reports indicated. Professor Hartwell's investigation also revealed the broader context of Blackwood's resistance to safety improvements. The mine owner was facing financial pressure from his Boston investors, who expected maximum returns on their capital investments. Safety expenditures were seen as unnecessary overhead that reduced profitability, and Blackwood's bonuses were directly tied to maintaining low operating costs, regardless of human consequences. "This isn't just local indifference," the professor explained. "It's systemic prioritization of short-term profits over worker safety, backed by financial structures that reward cost-cutting and penalize investment in protective measures." The evidence that Emma, Professor Hartwell, and their informal network had compiled was both damning and comprehensive. Technical documentation proved that safety hazards were both preventable and systematically ignored. Medical records showed patterns of injury and illness that correlated directly with those hazards. Worker testimony provided first-hand accounts of dangerous conditions and company retaliation against safety advocates. And financial analysis demonstrated that improved safety measures would actually increase long-term profitability by reducing accident-related costs and improving worker productivity. But assembling evidence was only the beginning of their challenge. Presenting that evidence effectively would require navigating territorial political structures that were often influenced by the same business interests they were challenging. Mining companies provided significant tax revenue and employment in Colorado Territory, giving them considerable leverage with elected officials, who might be reluctant to impose regulations that could affect economic development. Emma's role in this process was evolving beyond what anyone had initially envisioned. Her status as Daniel's intended widow provided moral authority that academic arguments alone could not match, but she was also developing genuine expertise in mining safety issues through her intensive study of technical literature and close collaboration with Professor Hartwell. Her correspondence with safety advocates in other territories had connected her to a broader movement for industrial reform that was gaining momentum throughout the western states. The first real test of their campaign came when Territorial Mine Inspector Jack Sullivan, no relation to Jimmy Sullivan, arrived in Copper Falls for what was supposed to be a routine annual inspection. Emma and Professor Hartwell saw this as an opportunity to present their evidence to an official who had both legal authority and professional responsibility for mining safety. But they quickly discovered that Inspector Sullivan's relationship with mining companies was more collaborative than adversarial, focused on maintaining industry cooperation rather than enforcing strict safety standards. The inspector's visit to the Salvation Mine was conducted with advance notice and company supervision that ensured he saw only the safest and best maintained areas of the operation. When Emma attempted to present additional evidence of safety violations in areas not included in the official tour, Sullivan dismissed her concerns as the emotional reactions of someone traumatized by personal tragedy rather than objective assessments of actual conditions. "Miss Walsh, I understand your grief over Mr. Morrison's death," the inspector said with patronizing sympathy. "But mining is inherently dangerous work, and accidents happen despite everyone's best efforts. The company has cooperated fully with this investigation, and I found no evidence of systematic safety violations." Emma realized that official channels alone would not be sufficient to force meaningful changes. The regulatory system was structured to accommodate industry concerns rather than protect workers. And inspectors were more interested in maintaining cordial relationships with mine owners than in confronting uncomfortable truths about preventable accidents. If Daniel's vision of a safer mining industry was to be realized, it would require pressure from outside the existing regulatory framework. Professor Hartwell reached the same conclusion, though his analysis focused on the political and economic dimensions of the challenge they faced. "The problem isn't just technical or regulatory," he explained to Emma after Sullivan's departure. "It's structural. The entire system is designed to prioritize capital returns over worker safety, and officials who should be protecting workers are actually protecting industry interests." Emma spent that evening in Daniel's cabin, surrounded by his research papers and her own growing collection of documentation. Outside, the first serious snowfall of winter was beginning, coating the mountain landscape in white that would soon make travel difficult and isolate the community for months at a time. The approaching winter represented both obstacle and opportunity. While it would limit outside contact and support, it would also trap company officials and workers together in conditions that might force confrontation over issues that could no longer be ignored or postponed. The decision that crystallized that night would transform Emma's advocacy from careful documentation and polite requests for reform into something approaching open resistance. If official channels would not respond to evidence and moral arguments, then unofficial channels would have to be explored. If regulatory systems would not protect workers, then workers would have to find ways to protect themselves. And if Daniel's sacrifice was to have lasting meaning, It would have to inspire action that went beyond the boundaries of conventional advocacy and challenge the fundamental assumptions of how power was exercised in company towns. Emma Catherine Walsh, who had arrived in Copper Falls expecting to become a miner's wife, was about to become something the territory had rarely seen, a woman willing to take on an entire industrial system in pursuit of justice for workers who had no other champion. The promise she had made to honor Daniel's memory was evolving into something that would test every assumption about women's roles, workers' rights, and the power of individual conscience to challenge institutional indifference. December's bitter cold arrived early that year, blanketing Copper Falls in snow that turned the mountain town into an isolated fortress of ice and determination. The storm that had been brewing between Emma's growing coalition of workers and Henry Blackwood's corporate interests was about to break with the force of an avalanche, triggered by events that would test every alliance she had carefully built. Over the autumn months, the catalyst came in the form of a telegram delivered to Walter Kenning at the Copper Falls Gazette on a frozen morning when the temperature had dropped so low that ink froze in inkwells. The message was from a colleague at the Denver Post who had been investigating mining accidents throughout the territory, and its contents would shake the foundations of Blackwood's carefully constructed narrative about industrial safety in Colorado's copper mines. 3 mines operated by companies with financial ties to Blackwood's Boston investors had experienced major accidents in the past 6 months, resulting in 47 deaths and over 100 serious injuries. The pattern of these accidents, gas explosions, cave-ins caused by inadequate support structures, and equipment failures related to deferred maintenance, mirrored exactly the hazards that Daniel Morrison had documented at the Salvation Mine. More significantly, territorial records showed that each mine had received safety citations in the months preceding their accidents, citations that had been appealed and delayed through legal processes until the warnings became academic rather than preventive. Walter brought the telegram to Emma's cabin through snow that reached his knees, his face grim with the weight of information that demanded immediate action. Emma read the message twice before fully grasping its implications for their advocacy campaign. The evidence they had been meticulously gathering about local safety violations was not an isolated problem, but part of a systematic pattern of negligence that extended throughout the mining operations controlled by Blackwood's financial network. "This changes everything," Emma said, her breath visible in the cold air of the cabin despite the fire burning in Daniel's stone fireplace. "We're not just fighting for improvements at one mine, we're documenting evidence of a conspiracy to ignore safety regulations across multiple operations." The telegram also contained information that made Emma's blood run cold with recognition. One of the mines that had experienced a fatal gas explosion was operated by a foreman named Robert Harrison, who had corresponded extensively with Daniel about safety improvement techniques. Harrison had died in the explosion along with 6 other workers, trapped underground when inadequate ventilation systems allowed gas to accumulate to explosive levels. His widow had been evicted from company housing within a week of his funeral and told that his safety advocacy had contributed to the accident by distracting workers from established procedures. Emma found herself staring at Daniel's research papers with new understanding. His careful documentation of safety hazards at the Salvation Mine represented more than local concern for worker welfare. It was evidence that could expose a pattern of criminal negligence that extended throughout a major mining operation. The technical drawings and correspondence that had seemed like academic exercises were actually blueprints for preventing the kinds of accidents that had already killed dozens of workers in similar operations. Sam arrived at the cabin that evening to find Emma surrounded by maps and financial documents that Professor Hartwell had provided, her auburn hair disheveled from hours of intense concentration. The past months had transformed her from a grieving mail-order bride into something approaching a detective, someone capable of connecting scattered pieces of evidence into comprehensive patterns of corporate malfeasance. Her green eyes held a fierce determination that reminded Sam of Daniel in his most focused moments, but with an edge of strategic thinking that suggested she was operating on a level of analysis that even Daniel might not have achieved. "I've been thinking about what Walter learned today," she said without preamble. "If the same investors control multiple mining operations, and if those operations are all experiencing similar safety problems, then individual advocacy at each location won't be sufficient. We need coordinated action that addresses the entire network simultaneously." Sam settled into Daniel's reading chair, studying Emma with growing concern. The intensity of her commitment to continuing Daniel's work was admirable, but he worried that she was taking on responsibilities that would consume her life entirely. The woman who had arrived in Copper Falls, expecting to build a quiet domestic life with a miner, was evolving into someone willing to challenge an entire industrial system, regardless of personal cost. "Emma, you're talking about taking on some of the most powerful financial interests in the territory," he said carefully. "These aren't just local business owners. They're connected to banking families and political networks that reach all the way back to Boston and New York. The kind of people who can destroy careers and reputations with a few strategic conversations." "Then it's fortunate that I don't have a career or reputation to protect," Emma replied with bitter humor. "I'm a widow who never got married, living in a cabin that belongs to a dead man, fighting for workers who are too scared to fight for themselves. What exactly can they take away from me that hasn't already been lost?" But Emma's analysis went deeper than simple defiance of powerful interests. She had been studying the financial relationships that connected Blackwood's operation to the broader mining industry, using information that Professor Hartwell had obtained through his academic connections. The pattern that emerged revealed a systematic approach to maximizing profits through cost-cutting measures that consistently sacrificed worker safety for short-term financial gains. The Boston investors who financed these mining operations expected quarterly returns that could only be maintained by avoiding expenditures for safety equipment and preventive maintenance. Mine operators who failed to meet profit targets faced replacement by managers more willing to accept risks with other people's lives. The regulatory system that should have provided oversight was undermined by the same financial pressures, with officials who depended on industry cooperation for their own career advancement. "It's not just greed," Emma explained, pointing to a chart she had created showing the relationship between profit targets and safety expenditures across multiple mines. "It's a business model that requires worker deaths to remain profitable. Every safety improvement reduces immediate returns, so the system is designed to prevent improvements regardless of human consequences." The conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the door. Sam opened it to reveal Clara Jensen, the schoolteacher who had become one of Emma's closest allies in organizing the families affected by mining accidents. Clara was a woman in her 30s with the quiet strength that came from years of teaching children whose fathers might not return from work each day, and her usual composure was replaced by barely controlled panic. "Emma, you need to come quickly," Clara said, her voice shaking with cold and fear. "There's been another accident in Shaft 7. 3 men trapped, maybe more. They're saying gas levels are too high for rescue operations." The 3 women and Sam rushed through the snow toward the mine entrance, where a crowd of workers and families had gathered despite the bitter cold. The scene was illuminated by torches and lanterns that cast dancing shadows against the white landscape, creating an almost medieval atmosphere of vigil and dread. Emma could see Henry Blackwood standing near the mine office, his expensive coat and confident posture marking him as distinctly separate from the workers, whose lives hung in the balance below ground. Dr. Hayes emerged from the mine entrance, his medical bag in hand and his face grim with the expression Emma had learned to associate with preventable tragedies. The accident had occurred when workers attempted to clear a blockage in the ventilation system that had been reported as problematic for weeks. Gas had accumulated behind the obstruction, and the workers' efforts to remove it had triggered a small explosion that collapsed part of the tunnel and trapped 3 men in a pocket of poisonous air. How long can they survive? Emma asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Without proper breathing apparatus, maybe an hour in those conditions, Dr. Hayes replied quietly. But the company says rescue operations are too dangerous. Until the gas clears naturally, which could take 6 to 8 hours. Emma felt the familiar surge of rage that had become her constant companion since learning about the conditions that had killed Daniel. The 3 trapped workers were facing the same choice that Daniel had confronted, waiting for slow death from gas poisoning or risking immediate death in rescue attempts. But unlike Daniel's situation, this crisis was unfolding with company. Officials present and rescue equipment theoretically available, making the decision to delay rescue operations a matter of corporate policy rather than emergency necessity. What kind of rescue equipment does the mine have? She asked Sam, who had worked with Daniel to inventory safety resources throughout the operation. Breathing apparatus for 4 men, portable ventilation fans, and rope rescue equipment, Sam replied. Everything needed for immediate rescue operations in exactly this kind of situation. Emma turned toward Blackwood, who was consulting with his mine superintendent while seemingly ignoring the families, whose husbands and sons were dying in the tunnels below. The mine owner's calm demeanor in the face of preventable tragedy crystallized everything that Emma had come to understand about the systematic devaluation of workers' lives in pursuit of corporate profits. "Mr. Blackwood," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the crowded area despite the wind. "Your workers are trapped in conditions that your own safety equipment could address. Why aren't rescue operations beginning immediately?" Blackwood turned toward her with the expression of someone encountering an annoying interruption to important business. His response was delivered in the patronizing tone that Emma had learned to recognize as his standard approach to dismissing concerns from people he considered beneath serious consideration. "Miss Walsh, I understand your emotional involvement in mining safety issues, but rescue operations require careful planning and professional judgment. Rushing into dangerous situations often results in additional casualties rather than successful rescues. Professional judgment, like the decision to operate Shaft 7 with inadequate ventilation despite weeks of warnings from workers," Emma replied, her voice rising with controlled fury. "The same kind of careful planning that resulted in Daniel Morrison's death?" The confrontation was drawing attention from the assembled crowd, including workers who had been listening to company explanations with growing skepticism. Emma realized that this moment represented more than just a debate about rescue procedures. It was a test of whether the community would continue accepting company narratives about unavoidable tragedies or begin demanding accountability for preventable accidents. Professor Hartwell, who had remained in Copper Falls to continue his investigation despite the harsh weather, stepped forward to support Emma's challenge to Blackwood's authority. His academic credentials and technical expertise provided credibility that complemented Emma's moral authority as Daniel's intended widow, creating a combination of professional knowledge and personal conviction that was difficult for the mine owner to dismiss casually. "Mr. Blackwood, I've reviewed your mine's safety equipment inventory, and it includes everything necessary for immediate rescue operations in these conditions," the professor said with the measured authority of someone accustomed to academic debates. Delaying rescue operations for 6 hours when workers could be saved within 1 hour represents a management decision rather than a technical necessity. Blackwood's response revealed the extent to which corporate interests had superseded human considerations in his decision-making processes. The mine owner explained that rescue operations would require shutting down production in adjacent areas of the mine, resulting in lost productivity that could not be recovered. Insurance policies would cover the costs of worker deaths, but there was no compensation for production delays caused by rescue efforts that might ultimately prove unsuccessful. Every mining operation involves calculated risks, Blackwood continued, his tone suggesting that he was explaining obvious principles to people too unsophisticated to understand basic business realities. These men knew the dangers when they accepted employment, and their families will be provided for according to company policies. Emma felt something crystallize within her at that moment, a transformation from advocacy to active resistance that would change the trajectory of her campaign for mining safety reform. Blackwood's cold calculation of human lives against production schedules represented everything that Daniel had died fighting against, and everything that she had committed to changing through her continuation of his work. "Sam," she said quietly, "how many workers here know how to operate the rescue equipment?" "Half a dozen at least," Sam replied, beginning to understand the direction of her thinking. Danny made sure extra men were trained in case of emergencies. Emma turned to address the crowd of workers and families who had gathered around the mine entrance, her voice carrying with the kind of moral authority that comes from absolute conviction in the righteousness of one's cause. She was no longer simply advocating for safety improvements or requesting consideration of worker welfare. She was calling for direct action that would challenge the fundamental assumption that corporate authority superseded human life. "Your friends are dying while this man calculates profit margins," she announced, her words cutting through the mountain air like a blade. "The equipment to save them is sitting unused while he decides whether rescue operations are cost-effective. How long will you accept explanations that value productivity over the lives of your families?" The response from the assembled workers was immediate and decisive. Led by Sam and Jimmy Sullivan, a group of miners moved toward the equipment shed, where rescue apparatus was stored, making clear their intention to organize rescue operations with or without official approval. Other workers began organizing support activities, preparing ropes and ventilation equipment, positioning lamps to illuminate rescue routes, and coordinating with Dr. Hayes to establish emergency medical stations. Blackwood's attempt to maintain control over the situation revealed the extent to which his authority depended on worker compliance rather than legal mandate or technical expertise. When confronted with organized resistance from people who understood mining operations as well as he did, his threats of termination and eviction seemed suddenly hollow and ineffective. "I'm warning all of you," he announced, his voice rising to compete with the growing activity around the rescue preparations. "Any worker who participates in unauthorized operations will be immediately dismissed and removed from company housing." Emma stepped forward to respond, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the challenge she was issuing to established power structures throughout the mining industry. Her words would be remembered and repeated in mining camps throughout the territory, marking the moment when workers stopped accepting company narratives about unavoidable tragedies and began demanding accountability for preventable deaths. "Then dismiss them all," she said calmly. "Evict every family. Shut down the entire operation. Because these people will no longer accept the choice between watching their friends die and losing their jobs." Daniel Morrison died fighting for that principle, and his sacrifice will not be meaningless. The rescue operation that began that night would save 3 lives and transform the relationship between workers and management throughout the Colorado mining territory. But it would also trigger a campaign of retaliation and resistance that would test every alliance Emma had built and force her to discover depths of courage and determination she had never known she possessed. The rescue operation that saved Thomas Mueller, Patrick O'Malley, and young Billy Hendricks became the spark that ignited a transformation neither Emma nor Henry Blackwood could have anticipated. By dawn, news of the workers' successful defiance of company orders had spread throughout the mining camps of Colorado Territory, carried by telegraph operators who understood that some stories transcended their usual discretion about company affairs. The 3 men emerged from Shaft 7 alive, because their fellow workers had chosen human decency over corporate authority, and that choice would reshape the relationship between labor and capital throughout the mountain mining region. Emma stood in the yellow kitchen of Daniel's cabin, reading telegrams that had arrived throughout the morning from mining communities across 3 territories. Workers in Silver Creek had organized their own safety committees. Miners in Leadville were demanding immediate inspections of their operations. Families in Central City were holding meetings to discuss collective action against unsafe working conditions. The rescue at Copper Falls had demonstrated that corporate authority was not absolute, that workers possessed both the technical knowledge and moral courage to protect themselves when management failed in its basic responsibilities. But Henry Blackwood's response to this challenge came with the swift brutality of a man accustomed to crushing resistance before it could spread beyond manageable proportions. By noon on the day after the rescue, eviction notices had been delivered to the families of every worker who had participated in the unauthorized operation. The company store cut off credit to anyone associated with the rescue effort. Blackwood announced that the Salvation Mine would suspend operations indefinitely while disloyal employees were replaced with workers who understood their proper relationship to legitimate authority. The economic warfare that Blackwood unleashed was designed to force the community's submission through starvation and exposure. Winter in the Colorado mountains was not a season that forgave homelessness or unemployment, and the mine owner calculated that faced with the choice between capitulation and watching their children freeze, even the most defiant workers would eventually accept his terms for returning to work under his absolute control. But Blackwood had fundamentally misunderstood the transformation that had occurred in Copper Falls over the months since Daniel Morrison's death. The community that Emma had helped organize was no longer a collection of isolated families competing for company favor, but a network of mutual support that had learned to function independently of corporate benevolence. Margaret O'Brien opened her store's credit to evicted families, accepting personal responsibility for their debts. Dr. Hayes continued treating injured workers regardless of their ability to pay company-mandated fees. Clara Jensen organized the schoolhouse as a community center where families could gather for warmth and shared meals. Most significantly, Sam Carter and the other experienced miners began organizing cooperative work groups that could potentially operate mining claims independently of Blackwood's corporate structure. Professor Hartwell's connections to Colorado mining law revealed that territorial regulations actually favored small-scale cooperative operations, providing legal frameworks that could protect worker-owned enterprises from corporate retaliation. The expertise that Daniel had developed in mining safety could be applied to creating operations that prioritized worker welfare over maximum profit extraction. Emma found herself at the center of these developments, serving as coordinator for activities that ranged from immediate crisis management to long-term economic planning. Her correspondence with mining safety advocates throughout the Western Territories had evolved into a network of practical support that provided both technical guidance and financial assistance for communities challenging corporate control over their working conditions. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Copper Falls, seeking domestic security, was becoming a regional coordinator for industrial reform efforts that would reshape mining practices throughout the American West. The turning point came when territorial authorities finally responded to the mounting pressure from multiple mining communities. A team of federal inspectors arrived in Colorado Springs with orders to conduct comprehensive safety evaluations of major mining operations, focusing specifically on the facilities controlled by Blackwood's Boston Financial Network. The inspectors were not local officials who depended on industry cooperation for their careers, but federal employees whose authority superseded territorial political considerations and whose professional reputations depended on honest enforcement of safety regulations. Walter Kenning's documentation of safety violations, Professor Hartwell's technical analyses, and Emma's coordination of worker testimony provided the inspectors with evidence that was both comprehensive and irrefutable. The pattern of accidents across multiple mines, the systematic suppression of safety concerns, and the retaliation against workers who attempted to address hazardous conditions created a case that demanded federal intervention regardless of local political pressures or economic considerations. Blackwood's attempt to influence the federal investigation through his Boston connections revealed the limitations of corporate power when confronted with sustained public pressure, and documented evidence of criminal negligence. The mine owners' confident assumption that financial influence could override regulatory enforcement crumbled when faced with inspectors who were answerable to federal authorities rather than local business interests. His threats of economic retaliation lost their effectiveness when applied to officials whose careers did not depend on maintaining cordial relationships with mining companies. The federal enforcement action that resulted from the investigation exceeded even Emma's most optimistic expectations for achieving meaningful reform. The Salvation Mine was ordered to implement comprehensive safety improvements before resuming operations, including installation of modern ventilation systems, replacement of obsolete safety equipment, and establishment of worker safety committees with authority to shut down dangerous operations. Similar orders were issued to every mine in Blackwood's network, creating industry-wide standards that would prevent the kinds of accidents that had claimed Daniel Morrison's life. But the most significant change was the recognition of workers' legal rights to participate in safety decision-making without facing retaliation from management. The federal regulations established that workers who reported safety violations or participated in safety advocacy were protected from termination, eviction, or other forms of corporate punishment. The principle that Daniel had died defending, that workers deserved protection from preventable hazards, became enforceable law rather than idealistic aspiration. Emma received word of the federal enforcement action while sitting in Daniel's reading chair, surrounded by correspondence from mining communities that had followed Copper Falls' example in organizing their own safety advocacy efforts. The telegram from Professor Hartwell was brief but comprehensive. Complete victory. All safety requirements approved. Worker protection provisions established. Your husband's vision vindicated. His sacrifice redeemed. The phrase "your husband's vision" reminded Emma of the complex relationship she had developed with Daniel Morrison's memory over the months. Since her arrival in Copper Falls, she had never met the man whose research and advocacy had shaped her understanding of mining safety issues. Yet their correspondence had created a bond that transcended the physical separation of death. His commitment to protecting fellow workers had become her commitment to continuing his unfinished work, creating a partnership that had achieved in death what it might never have accomplished in life. Sam arrived at the cabin that evening to find Emma packing Daniel's technical drawings and safety documentation into wooden crates. Her decision to donate his research materials to the Colorado School of Mines would ensure that future mining engineers would understand the human costs of inadequate safety measures and the practical benefits of worker-centered approaches to industrial planning. The cabin that had been prepared for a domestic partnership would become a monument to successful advocacy for social justice. "Will you be returning to Chicago now that the work is finished?" Sam asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The work will never be finished," Emma replied, gesturing toward the stack of letters on Daniel's desk. "There are mining communities from Arizona to Montana that need the same kind of organization and advocacy that we developed here. Professor Hartwell has offered me a position coordinating safety education programs throughout the Western Territories." Emma's decision to remain in Colorado represented more than personal choice. It reflected her understanding that individual tragedies could be transformed into collective action when people found the courage to challenge systems that treated human lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of profit. Daniel Morrison's death had been a preventable accident caused by corporate negligence, But his sacrifice had ultimately saved hundreds of lives through the safety reforms that his advocacy had inspired. The wedding that Emma had traveled to Colorado to attend would never take place. But the partnership she had formed with Daniel's memory had achieved something more lasting than domestic happiness. Their collaboration had proven that ordinary people possessed the knowledge and determination necessary to challenge powerful interests and create meaningful change in their communities. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Copper Falls seeking a husband had discovered instead a calling that would reshape industrial safety practices throughout the American mining frontier. Henry Blackwood's financial empire would survive the federal enforcement actions, though his profit margins would never again be subsidized by worker deaths from preventable accidents. The mine owner's assumption that corporate authority was absolute had been permanently shattered by the demonstration that communities could organize effective resistance to economic exploitation. His workers would return to their jobs under conditions that protected their health and safety, backed by federal regulations that made their protection a legal requirement rather than management discretion. The transformation of Copper Falls from company town to worker-protected community became a model that spread throughout the mining territories, inspiring similar organizing efforts in dozens of communities where workers had previously accepted dangerous conditions as the inevitable price of employment. Emma's coordination of these efforts established networks of mutual support and technical expertise that would influence labor relations throughout the American West for generations. Margaret O'Brien's General Store evolved into an informal headquarters for regional labor organizing, with Emma using her correspondence network to connect communities facing similar challenges with resources and strategies that had proven successful. Dr. Hayes's medical documentation of injury patterns became a standard reference for federal safety inspectors investigating mining operations throughout Colorado Territory. Clara Jensen's community organizing techniques were adapted by mining families from California to Wyoming, who were learning to function as mutual support networks rather than isolated competitors for corporate favor. The cabin where Daniel Morrison had prepared for his wedding to a bride he would never meet became the foundation for a movement that would protect thousands of workers from the kinds of preventable accidents that had claimed his life. Emma's transformation from mail-order bride to labor organizer demonstrated that the most powerful social change sometimes emerges from the most personal tragedies, when individual grief is channeled into collective action that challenges the systems responsible for preventable suffering. Spring returned to the Rocky Mountains with the promise of renewal and continued struggle. As Emma prepared for her next assignment, coordinating safety advocacy in the silver mining camps of Nevada Territory, Daniel Morrison's final wish that his sacrifice should protect other workers from similar fates had been fulfilled beyond anything he could have imagined when he made his dying request to Sam Carter in the poisoned air of Shaft 7. The promise had been kept, the work would continue, and the legend of the mail-order bride who had challenged an empire would inspire mining communities throughout the American West to believe that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they acted together in pursuit of justice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.